Today we're talking about domain and range and the different notations we can write them in. Now, inequality notation is something you've seen before. So for example, we might say x is greater than 4. Well, what that means on our number line is there's an open circle on 4 and greater than 4 points to the right. Now, if we change that to x is greater than or equal to 4, now there's a closed circle on the 4 and it points to the right. The other inequality we could see is maybe x is less than -2. So here's -2, open circle on -2, and it points to the left. If we said x is less than or equal to -2, then we have a closed circle still pointing to the left. So if the variable's in front, one way to remember is that the head of your arrow is pointing the same way as the symbol. If the variable's in the front, that always works. So quick example number 1, in inequality notation, your domain would be x is greater than or equal to 0. So notice it's pointing to the right and it's a closed circle. So it's greater than or equal to. Check out number 2. Now this one's a little bit different. It's got 2 things going on. So we're going to write it in 2 pieces. We're going to say x is less than or equal to -2, or, then we count the other one, x is greater than 1. So in our notes, we can say if I've got something with 2 pieces going opposite directions, I put or in between. Now the other thing you could see is maybe you have something like this. I think where it looks like, barbells at the gym. So let's make this one a -3 and make that one a 5. So what we do on this one, we can write it as 2 separate statements, or we can just kind of smush them into one. So this one, I'm going to say -3 is less than, open circle, x, and then closed circle, I'm going to say less than or equal to 5. So what this is saying, but mushed into one statement, we're saying that x is bigger than -3. That's what this first part says. And we smushed them together. X is less than or equal to 5. So we went bigger than -3, but smaller than 5, and we get everything in between. So if you have an in-between graph, you can smush them together into one statement instead of writing them separately with the word and in between. So that's number 3 right there. Notice open circle on -4, closed circle on 2, and it goes all in between. So in inequality, we're going to say -4 is less than x is less than or equal to 2. And notice when we do this statement, it's always less than symbols. Don't put a greater than, and it's always less than symbols. Number 4 in inequality, a closed circle on 3, and the arrow points to the left. So I'm going to say x is less than or equal to 3. So as long as you put your variable in the front, your arrow just matches, your symbol just matches your arrow. Let's talk about interval notation, because this one's kind of cool. In interval notation, instead of using the greater than, less than symbols, we use parentheses. Now, parentheses is equivalent to an open circle. So if the point is not included, we use parentheses. Brackets is if it is included. So brackets equal a closed circle. Now, instead of just going x is less than something, we use infinity and negative infinity. So positive infinity would be if the arrow's pointing to the right and it goes on forever. Negative infinity would be if it's pointing to the left and goes on forever. The union symbol is used if you have to break up the domain and range, a skip in the graph. This is if you had to put an or, you would use that U symbol. So here's some examples of what inequality would look, or interval notation would look like. -3, 4. So if I took this right here and wrote it in inequality, I would do parentheses -3. Now 5 was my closing number, but it had a closed circle on it, so that would get a bracket. So this statement right here would be parentheses -3, 5 bracket. That means the exact same thing, just in a different notation. Let's look at number 2, and we'll match this interval, sort of. In interval notation, why don't we just start at number 1? So notice it starts at 0 and it's a closed circle. That gets a bracket, 0. It points to the right and it keeps going to infinity. And infinity always gets parentheses. Because infinity, we never actually get to infinity. Because infinity is not an actual number. It's not a place. But that's all it would take to write this in interval notation. We're going to use interval notation a lot this year, so it's a new one we have to get used to. So for this one, it's split up into 2 pieces. So we're going to write the first one and put a U in the middle and write the second one. So just read it from left to right. Notice it's an arrow pointing to the left. That's infinity. However you want to write your infinity, comma, it gets to -2 and it stops with a closed circle. That's a bracket. Now we'll do a U. You've just met Jolie and Bo. Welcome to my world. So here we got the union, and then over here, the open circle at 1. So that gets a parentheses. And then it points to the right to positive infinity. And remember, infinities always get parentheses. Sorry, at the beginning here, I should have put a negative in front of my infinity. Negative infinity to -2, stop with a closed circle. A break in the middle, so union, 1, open circle, to infinity. So interval notation, you just read it from left to right, and you write down what you see. So number 3, if I start at the left, there's a -4. It had an open circle, that's parentheses. So now I keep going, it stops here at 2, and it's a closed circle, so it gets a bracket. And that's all there is to it. Number 4, it's pointing to the left, so that's negative infinity. Infinities always get parentheses. It stops, go left to right, at +3 with a closed circle, so it's a bracket. That's what we do. Now, in number 5, we start talking about domain and range. You did this in Algebra 1. So just a reminder, your domain is your x's and your range is your y's. And you can think of that alphabetically. D comes before R, X comes before Y. So I like to do interval first, because interval you just read from left to right. So if I'm looking my domain, I'm going from left to right. It starts here pointing to the left, that's infinity. And then I trace it. Now, -1 is closed circle on both of these, so there's no skip as far as going left to right. So in interval notation, this is going to be all real numbers, negative infinity to positive infinity. There's no breaks when you look at it from left to right. In inequality, we just put all real numbers. And you can write out the words all real numbers, or you could make that fancy capital R, which stands for all real numbers. Now let's look at the range. Now the range you're going to read from bottom to top. So if I start at the bottom, this is pointing to negative infinity. But notice there's a gap right there. So this is going to be the one that's split up into two pieces with a U in the middle. So my range started from negative infinity. Now remember, we're reading up and down. It got to 1 and it stopped with a closed circle. I'll put a U because I'm going to connect this to here. There's a break in between. It picks back up at 4. And that's as far as it goes. So there's two ways we can write that. You can just put the 4, because it was a closed circle, in brackets. I've also seen it where you put 4, 4. Kind of unusual. Now, how do I write that in inequality notation? Well, I went from negative infinity up to 1. So inequality would read x is less than or equal to 1. Or, and now since it just hangs at exactly 4, I'm just going to say x equals, your range is y equals. It's an easy mistake to make. Y equals 4. In interval notation, you don't have to distinguish x's and y's, but in inequality, your range has to be a y, and your domain has to be an x. Okay, let's do some more. Number 6. Interval notation. That's just reading left to right, up and down. Notice this is a line pointing in both directions. So I'm going to say negative infinity to positive infinity. Range going up and down. It's just arrows pointing on forever. Negative infinity to positive infinity. I like those. Those are easy. Number 7. Remember, domain reads left to right. If I start at this arrow and I go all the way over, there are no breaks. So that's going to go from negative infinity to infinity, all real numbers. Now, if I look at the range, the lowest number I see is this negative 2, and the highest number I see is this 3. It's just everything in between. And notice they're closed circles. So I'm going to say from negative 2 to positive 3 with the brackets. Number 8, this one wants inequalities. So those are the less than and greater than signs. Domain, it looks like I go from infinity here up to, or over to 1. But then notice up here, the 1 got covered. So 1 is actually included if I'm just going from left to right. So arrow, 1 that's covered, another arrow. So I'm going to say all real numbers for my domain. Now for my range, this is kind of interesting. The highest number I see is a 5, and it points down forever. So this gap in here got covered by that arrow, and then from here it goes down forever. So I'm going to say y is less than or equal to 5. And that covers everything vertically from top to bottom. All right, next up, let's look at our parabola. Inequality. So my domain is left to right. So look, I have arrow, that's going to go on forever. Arrow, that's going to go on forever. So inequality, I'm going to say all real numbers. Again, you can write the words all real numbers, or you can use the fancy R. Now my range from bottom to top, the first place I see is here at 0, and then it just goes up with arrows forever. So y, don't forget range is y, greater than or equal to 0. And our last one, we're going to do an interval notation. So our domain from left to right, so I'm coming over here, I get to an open circle at -4. Now it covers everything, and it stops over here at +4. So I'll put a 4 and a bracket. So it's from -4 to +4, everything in between, but that had an open circle, so I did not include the -4. My range is the up and down. So if I start at the bottom, the first number I see is 0, and it's got a closed circle. So bracket 0. If I come from the top, I get to 4. Now, this one's not included. This one is included, so it's included. So from 0 to 4, and you include the 4, because even though that had an open circle, that was included.